About a month ago, I was on YouTube. Shocker, right? And I came across a video of a woman who does something very interesting. And she takes lyrics from songs, very popular songs, and feeds them into Google Translator about 40 or 50 times into all these different languages. And then translates it right back to English and then performs the songs. Listening to this particular artist really inspired this morning's talk because I realized that we spend too much time trying to literally translate everything. And so with that in mind, hopefully you'll hear something this morning that inspires you. So any conversation that revolves around losing things in translation on a spiritual level always leads me to thinking about our ancient spiritual text. Whether it be the Bible, whether it be the Quran, doesn't matter what the text is, it always leads me to think about this. And one of the things that I found very interesting is when looking at the Bible and how the Bible came about to be written. In the beginning, the stories within the Bible were not written. They were passed down through oral translation from people to people. And what I found very interesting about this is originally the stories that pertain to Moses and his laws and the things that he passed down, of course, they were passed through oral tradition. And the Jews at that time mostly spoke a language called Aramaic, which is one of the ancient Semitic languages. Now, before it was Aramaic, they did speak Hebrew. But Hebrew went out of style sometime around 587 BC during the Babylonian exile. So we had these stories that were being told orally in a language different from what they originated. And that's important to understand because when it came time to then start transcribing all of these oral stories into written form, they were written in Hebrew, a language that had almost been lost. So they were written in what's referred to today as Biblical Hebrew. And only a couple of portions at that time were even written in Aramaic. There were only about 2 or 3. So you can imagine that through all of those times of the oral tradition, a lot was lost. How many people have ever played telephone? Okay? It doesn't matter how well of a storyteller you are. It changes little by little each time that you tell the story, and depending on what lesson you're trying to teach. So then we take these oral stories that began in one language, transferred into another one, and then the scribes come in and they start actually writing them down in a language that very few people actually understand anymore. Then, what do? But we take and we translate it into Greek. So we've got now what? Hebrew, Aramaic, back to Hebrew, and then Greek. Is it any wonder that now, centuries later, we have a hard time actually understanding what is being said? Now, I was watching a documentary, because that's something else I do a lot, and it was really telling the story of the authors of the Bible, which are not who we actually believe that they are. They're not necessarily, when we look at the Old Testament, they're not necessarily the people who are named that wrote it, and they used scribes. And at the time, there were no printing presses. So that meant every single version that was written was hand copied. And they found old, very ancient copies of the original what would become the Bible, with notes in the margins and subtle changes, stories that didn't feel like they had a good ending. In another version of it had a different ending. So little by little, all of these inspired words and stories really changed. Now, John Milton, who's the author of Paradise Lost, said this: "We believe in the scriptures in a general and overall way, first of all. And we do so because of the authority either of the visible church or of the manuscripts. Later, we believe in the church in those very manuscripts, and in particular sections of them, because of the authority and internal consistency of the whole Scripture. Finally, we believe in the whole Scripture because of the Spirit which inwardly persuades every believer. He then continues to say, nowadays the external authority for our faith, in other words, the Scriptures, is of very considerable importance, and generally speaking, it is the authority of which we first have experience. The preeminent and supreme authority, however, is the authority of the Spirit, which is internal and the individual possession of each man. Now that sounds like a very New Age enlightened thought, yes? That what we believe internally is the truth of what we're seeing. He wrote this in the 1600s. We tend to think that all of these are new ideas and new concepts, that our connection to the divine is within, not without. And with what he said, it really shows that people were open to understanding that it's not a verbatim translation of what's written. And regardless of whether you're talking about the Bible or any of the other sacred texts or any books that are currently written, what's really important to remember is to read understanding the context in which it was written, understanding the language at the time that it was written in. Languages are constantly evolving. They're constantly growing. I have a library full of books that were written in like 1900, 1910, 1920, and when you read them, you're like, oh my God, what were these people thinking? But if you put it into context as to what the culture was, what the society was, you start to be able to better understand what the actual message is. I tend to read books multiple times, and the reason I do is because every time I read, depending on my mood, depending on what questions I may or may not have, depending on just the topic, I will see and hear something completely different. Now, this does not have to be a spiritual book either. Gary can attest to the fact that I have read the entire Harry Potter series at least 15 times. Every single time I read it, I get something different from it. And I have literally been inspired in my way of thinking, how I treat others, how I understand life through those nonfiction books. Actually, fiction, sorry. I wish they were nonfiction. But even within fiction, we are able to find inspiration and tap into that divine wisdom because it doesn't come from what's written. It's not what somebody else tells you, but it's what it stirs inside of you, what feelings you have within. You can read an Archie comic book and know God. You really could. It just depends on where you are and if you allow yourself to be open to that inspiration that comes to you. Now, understanding how things can be lost in translation was a lesson I learned at the age of 15. At the age of 15, I moved to Guatemala, and I spoke not a lick of Spanish. And so I had to learn very quickly how to speak Spanish because I'm kind of a talker, and if people can't understand me, that's sort of a problem. So I learned to speak Spanish. And originally I started learning Castilian Spanish, which is the mother language in Spain, and found out that didn't fit very well in Guatemala because they didn't speak Castilian Spanish. Everybody was under the impression that Spanish was Spanish was Spanish. What I found after I could actually speak the language, I started meeting people from Honduras, from El Salvador, from Mexico, from Costa Rica. And I found out that Spanish is not Spanish. It's all the same words. And technically, they translate to being exactly the same thing. But it depends on the context. It depends on how it's used. It can depend on the inflection. So all of these things changed how you hear what you think you're hearing. And if you are not accustomed to the differences in different regions, different cultures, and different dialects, you are going to completely misunderstand what everybody's telling you. honestly. And I find this in today's society, even with English. We think of English as a very straightforward language, and it's actually not. Especially not when you start looking at the history of the language, how words have evolved, how meanings have evolved. There are certain words which I can't repeat up here, but I decided I wanted to know how they came about, and I was amazed at how some of our slang started off as very proper, very polite words, and they have descended into something that is a lot less polite, a lot less proper, and at times very negative. Now, going back to the text, the sacred text, it's really interesting to think about this as I brought up the Bible, but it's not just the Bible that we have to question. Within the Buddhist text, the sutras, depending on how many times they've been translated, you have to remember when they were written. The Hindu Vedas, those you read now, and they've been translated so many times, and when we read the translations, a lot of times they don't make sense. But we need to look at the context. We need to look at the society from which they came, because they do tell a very good story. Within the Islamic text, there's the Quran and the Hadith. Both of those are oftentimes very misunderstood because of when they were written, how they were written, and remembering again that in the beginning it was oral tradition. They were passed on from person to person, from father to son. And these things change. They constantly progress. Inspiration can come from anything. That divine truth that we all understand, we are going to understand in our own language. We're going to understand it based on our own concept of truth, our culture, our beliefs, unfortunately at times our prejudices and our judgments. So we see things not necessarily as they are, but as we think they are, as we believe that they should be. Which means when somebody tells you something, you can totally disregard it. Or you can read any book, listen to any song, speak to any person, and by being open to the truth that is within, hear what they are trying to express, and come together not in a war of words, because that is what we have in English. Really, honestly, to me, has a tendency to create this conflict between what is said and what is meant. Because you do have those people, and I used to be one of those, I still am a lot of times, that what you say to me is literal. Every word to me has a very specific meaning. What I learned, however, in understanding myself and really going within, is what words mean to me isn't necessarily what they mean to you. So while you could be trying to be very helpful, very uplifting, very spiritual, I might hear it very differently because you use a word that triggers something for me, because I've associated that word with something else. And where this really, really stands out for me in so many different ways is when we're talking about symbols and signs. Now, I am a big advocate of paying attention to your dreams, because I think our dreams do have a way of speaking to us and giving us information from our higher self that we could use in our daily lives if we knew how to understand them. There are tons of books out there for dream interpretation. I don't use a single one of them. And the reason is because what a book tells me that something means may not be what that represents to me. Everybody's symbols are going to be very different. So it's learning to understand what things mean to you. For example, if you dream of a house, a lot of people are going to say that a house is security. Some people are going to say that a house is your body. The best way to know what every symbol in a dream means is to think about What does that mean to me? When I say the word house, what's the first thing that comes to mind? When I see a cat, what's the first thing that it comes to mind? A lot of people are very much into spirit animals, which I think is fantastic and great. But instead of figuring out what those animals mean to them, they tend to go to books and they go to somebody else to tell them what that means. And I think at times you can lose what the true meaning of something is. A perfect example for me is doves in my life are very important, and they're very important because of my mother. Back in the 70s, she had a CB in her car, and her handle was White Dove. So for the rest of her life, she was known as White Dove. If anybody were to come to my house, they'd see all of these statues of doves all over the place. She even raised them. Since she has passed away, anytime I'm thinking of her, there is a single dove that always comes to my yard. I never see them any other time unless I'm thinking about her. So to me, when I see a dove, if I dream of a dove, I know that for me that is a message or something about my mother, whether a quality of her, whether the fact that, she's still with me. This week I actually saw quite a few doves. So it really cements that concept. So if you pay attention to your everyday life, whether it's in dreams or whether it's in your, as you go about your business, these symbols will appear. And if you take the time and really question, what does it mean to me? That's how you know your truth. About 10 or 15 years ago, I was introduced to a series of books called Conversations with God. And I really liked the series. I thought it was a fantastic series of books. But I had one small problem, and that was the title. I had a real hard time believing that one individual person could have these conversations with God, that God had the time to dictate a book to this person. And so it caused me a lot of issues as I was reading it, because I'm reading it going, well, this sounds really good, but I think the guy is on drugs. The concept didn't fit. As I've gone through my studies and as I've grown, become, a little wiser in some areas, I've come to realize that every single one of us has those conversations with God. God does speak through us and to us. Oftentimes we think we're talking to ourselves. Oftentimes we get it while we're reading something. Oftentimes we get it when we're talking to each other. It's that inner knowing that comes from in here that says, this is truth. This is my truth, and it resonates with me, and it lifts you up, and it empowers you. So regardless of who they say the author is, I think it is very, very appropriate to refer to them as conversations with God when we have conversations with ourselves. That's exactly what we're doing. When we get in touch with our higher self, with our divine self, with our true self, that is when we truly, truly can know the peace and serenity of abundance, of joy, instead of looking outward for all of the different things. I was reading something the other day, and it was talking about how we're constantly looking for something outside of ourselves, whether it's we'll be more spiritual if we were healthier. We'll be more spiritual if all the bills are paid. Everything seems to be dependent on something else from outside happening, or people being nicer to us. That serenity, that peace, and that calm, no matter what storm you are facing, no matter what challenges are there for you, by going within and connecting to that divine self and understanding that truth that comes from within, it makes everything else, I'm not going to say it goes away, because it doesn't go away. We are living a human experience. But what it does do is it makes it so that we understand that our connection, our love, our prosperity, all of it comes from one place. And it doesn't matter what's going on in the outside world. There is a lot of chaos going on right now. Every corner of the world there's chaos, and it doesn't matter which side of any issue, and I'm definitely not talking about any issue, and I'm talking globally. Doesn't matter what you believe on those issues, we have a huge conflict, and a big part of that conflict is because we are not understanding what others are saying. We are too busy thinking about our response to it. We are too busy living in that anger. We are responding immediately to what we see instead of going within and trying to understand really what we believe. We're allowing other people to tell us what we believe. And the reason that I chose this morning's topic of being lost in translation is we all know that all of our sacred texts, all of them, doesn't matter where they come from, have all at one time been used as both a weapon and as a source of inspiration. Because depending on what you want it to say, you will find it. You will find something in there that supports it, if for no other reason than because you are reading somebody else's translated version of someone else's translated version of someone else's translated version. The best thing to do, and I'm not saying do not read them, because I fully believe there's so much wisdom and so much guidance available, but read not with your eyes, but with your heart. Listen not with your ears, but with your soul. Figure out, understand, and accept what truly resonates to you and what it means. And I will tell you, sometimes you'll read something and it will mean something completely different to you, but that is your truth. And it may have even nothing to do with what you just read. Belief is not surrendering to the beliefs of others, but it's an internal knowing and a sense of connection of the truth beyond the interpretations of others. The divine in me recognizes the divine in you. Thank you.